This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and it's Friday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. At least, that's normally what I do in this series. Sometimes I like to look at the other end of the spectrum and look at the absolute worst cards in this game, and that's what we're doing today, with a look at the worst white cards ever printed. I've already looked at all the worst cards in the game by card type and at the worst cards in each two-color combination, but I haven't looked at videos in each color, and obviously that's something we're going to start looking at with this video. As usual, my worst videos aren't quite as data-driven as my videos where I look at good cards, and ultimately, the way this list shakes out is based on my own opinion. However, I do use data to help me make my selections. Obviously enough, a card shouldn't really be here if it has ever been featured in a successful competitive Magic deck, nor should it be here if it's widely played in EDH. For the EDH side of things, I use EDHR since it features a database of 436,000 EDH decks. Most of the cards on this list are also unplayable and limited. Alright, let's get to my picks for the 10 worst white cards ever printed. At number 10, it is TAKENO'S CAVALRY. By far, the Cavalry is played in the most EDH decks of any card on this list, but it seems like the only reason for that is people are desperate for samurais. I would imagine the number of decks it's played in will go down after our imminent visit to Kamigawa, where we will presumably get more samurais who are better than this one. In fact, I'd be willing to say that literally every samurai we see in the upcoming set will be better than this one, because this is just an awful card. A 4-mana 1/1 is one of the ugliest stat lines around, and coming with the unimpressive Bushido 1 doesn't make much of a difference. Becoming a 2/2 when it blocks or gets blocked still means it's trading down. It does come with the ability to ping attacking or blocking spirits, which meant it could do a thing in Limited sometimes, but even in Limited, this probably shouldn't have been making your deck. And obviously outside of Limited, the ability to ping spirits is pretty much irrelevant. At number 9, I've got SAMITE ALCHEMIST. This starts out as a 4-mana 0/2, which is awful. A card with that stat line has to do something pretty awesome to overcome it, and SAMITE ALCHEMIST definitely doesn't. It has an ability that does actually do something, which is more than I can say for some of the other cards on this list, but it generally isn't going to be worth doing. You can pay 2 white to prevent 4 damage to a creature you control. That in itself isn't a great ability, but it would at least be decent upside. Unfortunately, that ability comes with a huge downside. It freezes the creature down so it doesn't untap during your next untap step. That effectively means that the creature you just saved is gone from the board, so what was the point in saving it anyway? At number 8, I've got 2 cards that I decided to put together since they're both terrible color-hosing cards: Heroism and Righteous Indignation. Heroism lets you sacrifice white creatures to blank the damage from attacking red creatures, provided your opponent doesn't pay a tax of 2 generic and a red, and that's awful. Fogging a single creature for a turn and giving up one of your creatures is just not what you want to be doing. Especially because you have to pay 3 mana for this thing in the first place. It's just salt in the wound that your opponent can just blank the effect if they want to. It's probably the worst of the two, but Righteous Indignation is also pretty awful. It makes it so that if a creature blocks a black or red creature, that blocker gets +1/+1. At least you don't have to give up a creature to get the effect here, and it affects more than one color, but it's still way too narrow. I mean, color hosing is already narrow enough, but both of these cards only work in very specific situations, and even when they do work, they're nothing special. At number 7, it is Ignoble Soldier. This is a 3-mana 3/1 that has a text box that is pure downside. If it gets blocked, it just doesn't do any combat damage. This means it can be blocked indefinitely by any creature at all. It's effectively a useless attacker on any board where your opponent has an untapped creature, especially because it still gets damaged, and that means it will die to a lowly 1/1 blocking it, and that 1/1 will just stick around. That doesn't really sound like it's worth your investment of 3 mana. The one thing it can do is block and kill things, and with 3 power it can at least make a decent trade, but that means this is pretty close to being a 3-mana 3/1 with Defender, and that's awful. At number 6, I've got Rapid Fire. This is a card that has the double dishonor of making it on my worst art video and making it on a video about cards that are also mechanically horrible. Anyway, Rapid Fire is a terrible combat trick. 2 mana for first strike isn't good, and adding Rampage 2 to the mix isn't meaningful either. Rampage 2 means that if a creature is blocked by more than one creature, the creature gets +2/+2 for each creature that blocks it beyond the first. Now, if you could play this combat trick whenever you wanted, it could at least be kind of a blowout, since you can just kill a bunch of blockers, but this card's fate as a horrible one is sealed by the fact that you can only play it before blockers are declared. This means your opponent can just choose not to block the creature that you just gave First Strike and Rampage 2 to. So basically, you spend 4 mana on this thing and you don't actually get anything, except in a situation where your creature absolutely has to be blocked. So yeah, you can combine it with a lure effect to do something pretty cool, but that's insanely situational and effectively makes this a blank card. At number 5, it's AVEN Trooper. A 4 mana 1/1 flyer is bad. It can die to pretty much anything, so giving up 4 mana for something like that isn't very good. And sure, it does fly, but so many flyers can block the Trooper effectively that it isn't like that matters. But hey, at least its text box is all upside, even if that upside isn't great. Paying 2 generic and a white and discarding a card to give this +1/+2 is not awesome, even in a world where you're trying to do stuff with your graveyard, or discarding cards with madness. It isn't like that ability makes it that much better as an attacker or a blocker, and the resources you have to give up are pretty significant between the mana and the card. Believe it or not though, there are still 4 cards on this list worse than the Trooper, including 2 more creatures. At number 4, I've got Alabaster Leech. It's part of a cycle of leeches from Invasion, all of which gave you an efficient creature for the cost while coming with a massive downside of making spells of that leech's same color cost 1 additional colored mana to cast. I've actually talked about this cycle a fair bit in other videos, partly because the green card in the cycle was actually surprisingly good back in the day, but the same can't be said for Alabaster Leech, which was certainly the worst of the bunch. 1 mana for a 1/3 was sort of a nice deal back in 2000, but not such a good deal that you would be willing to accept the massive downside. A 1/3 just won't have a big impact on your typical game, especially if it makes casting your other spells harder. If we really look at the card today, it's even worse, since we get Staunch Shieldmate, a 1 mana 1/3 with no downside at all, and it isn't exactly like that's a great card either. At number 3, I've got AKRON Legionnaire. This is another absolutely terrible white creature, and I think the worst white creature ever. This is an 8 mana 8/4 with a text box that is only downside. Only it and your artifact creatures can attack if it's in play. At least Alabaster Leech had sort of good stats for the cost and came with a downside. AKRON Legionnaire has one of the highest mana values in this entire game and gives you an absolutely terrible creature. And sure, you might have a deck of all artifact creatures or something, in which case the downside doesn't matter, but that means you're jumping through hoops for a card where the only payoff is that it's an 8 mana 8/4. It's a pretty sweet card to donate to someone during EDH, but that alone is pretty good evidence of how terrible a card is. At number 2, it's Fasting. White has a lot of cards that don't do anything but gain life, and most of them are pretty bad, because giving up a card to not impact the board at all and gain a few life just isn't worth it, and this is the worst possible version of that type of card. In this case, you don't just give up a card to gain life and not do anything else, you give up multiple cards for minimal upside. You have to skip your draw step in order to gain 2 life, something that is almost never going to be worth it. The more draw steps you skip, the more cards you're giving up to just gain life, and you just don't want to be doing that. You can't even get around the downside by drawing extra cards or something, because as soon as you do, Fasting gets destroyed. And at number 1, I've included 2 cards, because they're both enchantments that do something related to Planeswalk. Great Wall shuts down Planeswalk entirely, while Aeson Highway grants Planeswalk to all white creatures. The problem is both of these cards are incredibly narrow and cost way more mana than they should. This is the most pronounced with Great Wall, since there are only 8 cards in all of Magic that grant Planeswalk. You really don't need to be spending this mana on it. And most of the cards that do grant Planeswalk are terrible, like Aeson Highway, which makes you pay 6 mana for the effect. The fact the Highway is also symmetrical is pretty comical, since you probably have planes in play since you're playing this card, so granting your opponent stuff Planeswalk is pretty awful. Well, those are my picks for the 10 worst white cards ever printed. If you want to own any of these cards, because maybe you want to try and prove me wrong and show me how good these cards really are, you can find direct Card Kingdom links for each of them in the description. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future episodes of this series, please subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past episodes, including several more videos on the worst cards ever printed, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can do that on Patreon. Thanks for watching.